Hi, this is Kyle again, and we're now going to look at WPF concepts. WPF stands for Windows Presentation Foundation, and it's kind of an alternative to Windows Forms applications. We're going to see what's similar and different about WPF and Windows Forms applications, and talk about a few other things related to it as we see here. The first thing I should probably mention is how you find resources about it. Our textbook doesn't really cover this at all, but it is valuable, and you're going to see it's an emerging standard. So if you need a resource for WPF, there are a couple linked on the content section in DC Connect. If you go down here, you're going to see there's this complete WPF tutorial. That would be my preferred one. There's also this one. This one's WPFtutorial.com and this one's WPFtutorial.net. I prefer this one. I find the layout and navigation is not as good, but the content's a little better. WPFtutorial.com is a fairly useful resource on the subject that I do recommend. So there are two different standards for Microsoft-supported Forms-based applications, and so we're referring to Windows Forms applications and WPF. WPF is newer and as such is likely to become an adopted standard, but maybe that's not happening as fast as Microsoft had hoped. And perhaps the reason for that is that these .NET languages of VB and C#, they're really handy for that rapid application development, and people want things to just be simple. WPF, it's not necessarily simple, but it has some really neat characteristics. The first thing you're going to see here is that the Windows Forms applications make huge piles of C# or VB code that describe the form layout, whereas WPF uses a new markup standard called XAML, or they pronounce it XAML. If you've ever messed around in the designer page of a VB file, you know that that code is kind of huge and unwieldy, and it's describing the things that you've created in the designer view for a VB form. It can be very awkward to maintain, and it's probably best left to Visual Studio itself, but what goes on back there is a bit ugly. Using XAML is a better way to describe this type of formatting. WPF also separates the design work from the coding, which is valuable, and it also allows the graphics to be rendered by graphics hardware, which is valuable depending on the application. WPF allows for really neat scaling of forms and form elements, and we're going to look at how that works. But it allows things to run at different resolutions, and it's much easier to control how it appears on different screens and in a maximized state and other things like that. There's also custom controls possible, which is a big selling feature for some people. So having a button that, for example, has an image on it is much easier in WPF than it is on a Windows Forms application. XAML is a markup language used to describe the form layout, and so we had just a little foray into ASP, and if you've been comfortable working with ASP, you're likely to be comfortable working with XAML. It's very similar to other types of markup language you might see. It can be used to set form elements properties, kind of like you can in the Windows Forms application design view, and you can still use the design view, including the toolbox, when you're working with Windows Presentation Foundation, but there's reasons it can be a bit confusing or challenging. Let's look at how that appears. So here we've got a WPF application, actually a WPF form I should say. This is a blank one. It's got a slight change just to the title, but otherwise it's blank, as you can see here. And you can see the designer view already looks a little different, and the properties window looks a little different. Now it's still possible to drag the things in that I need. So suppose I want a text box in here and a button. You can see I'm using a split view right now, and you can see the code below. Inside the XAML here, you can see there's a grid tag that's opening that's containing all of the content of this form in one place. And here's the properties of the text box. It's got an alignment set, a height, a margin, text wrapping text box is the text in there. And I could change this to be example text, and we'll see that change. It may be a personal preference, but I find the properties window view when working with WPF a bit awkward. When if you're used to the XAML or other kinds of markup, you'll probably recognize you can edit some of the properties of things really easily right here by adjusting the tag. So I just made the height change from 23 to 40, and it's very easy to access all of these properties. You will notice that these things don't have names by default, so if I want to assign a name to the text box, I can actually do that up here. Then I can give a name to the button as well. There are a lot of other properties you can assign here. So it is possible to drag things in and adjust properties and work your layout like this. But there's also a lot of options for using grids and stack panels and things to organize, and that's what we'll talk about in the next video. One thing I feel I should address, because I'm often particular about accessibility features, is that many of the accessibility features work a bit differently here. If, for example, I wanted to give a hotkey B to the button here on the button, I would use an underscore rather than an ampersand. And so that will make the B the hotkey for the button. I'm also very particular about tab order, some of you have likely noticed. You actually have to assign the tab index like this. It's not quite as easy as it is in a Windows Forms application. But of course, when you're mindful of it, it's easy to go in and assign that value to each of the controls on the form. So in the next video, we'll be talking about some layout options.